of the Sixth World Parliament of Science, Religion and Philosophy, hosted by Dr. Vishwanath Karad, MIT World Peace University. MIT World Peace University is more than 3 decades old group of institutions, recently rechristened as the World Peace University, originally as MIT. I'm a proud alum of this institution, and I can see Mark has just joined us. Mark, good afternoon, if I may say so.
Yes,
It's still morning.
thank you for the invitation.
Yes. Is it still morning or afternoon at your end?
It's afternoon, it's 1 p.m.
Perfect. Good afternoon, Mark. Welcome. Yeah, we have all our panelists here. And today in this panel, we are going to look at the subject of the need for eradication of biological and chemical weapons. We will dive deep into this discussion. In the context of the discussion, we will also know why we, as MIT, Dr. Vishwanath Karad, MIT World Peace University, are interested in this subject matter and what is it that drives us to take this cause along with 70,000 plus students and 10,000 plus staff. There are very strong reasons that we feel about this. There's very strong feelings that we have about this cause, and we'll surely touch upon them. But before we go there, it's my duty, responsibility to officially welcome all our panelists and all our guests. To do that, I invite Dr. Mridula Kulkarni, Head of School, Civil Engineering, Dr. Vishwanath Karad, MIT World Peace University. Dr. Mridula, over to you.
Thank you, Darshan Mundadaji. On the occasion of 6th World Parliament of Science, Religion and Philosophy, and this session, 7th session, which is titled, and we will be discussing about the need for eradication of biological and chemical weapons. We have got array of eminent personalities with us to discuss this very prime important issue of biological and chemical weapons. As we know that biological weapons are devices intended to deliberately disseminate disease producing organisms or toxins in food, water, or by insect vectors or by aerosol. This affects the public health, medical, and military discord. Use of harmful chemicals in warfare, personal attack, and assassinations dates back to centuries, and it gave rise as it gave rise to the industrial production of chemicals in 19th century. It opened the door to massive use of chemical agents in the combat. During World War I, the use of chlorine gas had a very destructive effect. In almost 1925, Geneva Protocol sought in the ban of the use of biological and chemical weapons. In World War II also, it saw a sophisticated, large amount of chemical weapons. And now we are undergoing the corona pandemic. So as a members and faculty members of World Peace University, it is our prime duty that we contribute our bit for this cause, and which is for the mankind of the entire universe. I welcome all the dignitaries. We have the speakers with us, Mr. Andrew Weber, Mr. Mark Finan, and Dr. Joe Thomas. I welcome other panel members as well, and they are the experts in this field, and we would like to hear from you. Formally, I welcome you all on this platform. Thank you. Over to Darshan Mundadaji.
Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni, and thank you for laying out the landscape. You did my job easy, so I appreciate that. Thank you. The idea of today's panel, well, actually, I think before we go ahead, our tech team has prepared a short clip, kind of a curtain raiser to our session. May I request our tech team to play the curtain raiser video for the session, please?
There is no doubt that the biggest threat to survival of humanity is the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. The global pandemic of COVID-19 has impacted almost all major nations of the world and continues to envelop and threaten nearly all countries, including the rich and medically advanced ones. The BWC and OPCW are bodies that are tasked with getting rid of weapons of mass destruction from the world. Unfortunately, none of these bodies have the final authority to execute any decisions. The conference tries to bring countries together to evolve a mechanism to end the threat of bio-warfare.
Thank you for that succinct brief video team and tech team. Really appreciate that. As we understand the problem and we will dive deeper, I think it's pertinent that we spend a couple of minutes trying to understand who we are, the MIT World Peace University, and why we are doing that. Behind all of this, you can see behind me the digital image. You can see one of the world's biggest dome, the monument that stands tall as an visionary manifestation of revered Professor Dr. Vishwanath D. Karad sir, who I have been lucky enough to call my guru. Let us know about that dome, and slowly as we go through the discussion, we will connect the dots. Tech team, can we have the dome video, please?
इक्कीसवीं शताब्दी में मेरी भारत माता विश्व गुरु बनने की काबिलियत रखता है. It will become a विश्व गुरु in the 21st century. उसका छोटा सा उदाहरण, छोटा सा सिंबल यहाँ बन गया है, ऐसा मेरा मानना है.
I must say that in the entire history after the independence since 1947, this is one of the unique steps towards the contribution of universal humanity, and my government of India I appeal to the Vice President and Honorable Chief Minister to recognize this World Peace Dome as a structure of national and global importance and support to promote it in such a way that it evolves as one of the prominent tourism destinations of the world.
Thank you, tech team. The last clip that we saw in that video was from the Third World Parliament of Science, Religion and Philosophy, hosted at this dome in 2018. The Fourth World Parliament of Science, Religion and Philosophy. It's a tradition that started in 1996 and was revived in 2018 when the dome was inaugurated. The dome, the visionary manifestation of revered Professor Dr. Vishwanath D. Karad sir, is a monument dedicated for world peace. It's about students coming together and taking up causes that they believe in. It's about pursuing peace inside out. And one of the first causes that we've taken up is the eradication of biological and chemical weapons. And that's the reason we all are here today, to discuss the need for eradication of biological and chemical weapons. We have an esteemed panel. The panel is being chaired by revered Professor Dr. Vishwanath D. Karad sir, the visionary founder of Myers MIT Group, the creator of the dome. Though he would disagree when he speaks, he would surely disagree with me and say I'm not the creator, it's manifested. But we respect him from that perspective. Along with him, we have Honorable Mr. Andrew Weber. Andrew has been with us when in June we hosted a dedicated conference, 4 days of intense deliberations on this very subject. And today, as we discuss, we'll connect the dots between what we discussed then and what we are discussing today. Andrew is currently a senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks in Washington, D.C. In the Obama administration, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs. He has also played a key role in Nun Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction, which removed weapons grade uranium from Kazakhstan and Georgia, and nuclear capable Mikoyan MiG 29 from Moldova. Andrew also oversaw and developed the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and for his work has twice been awarded the Exceptional Civilian Service Medal. Along with that, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Along with Andrew, we have Honorable Mr. Mark Finot. Mark, am I pronouncing your name right? Is it Mark Finot?
Finot.
Yeah, Finot. Mark Finot. He's head of arms proliferation at Geneva Center for Security Policy at Geneva. Mark started his career at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Military Cooperation Division in 1977. He was also the first secretary at the French Embassy in Warsaw, and he was the counselor at the French delegation to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which specifically dealt with nuclear and outer space issues, as well as conventional and biological weapons. Mark's introduction actually runs in 2 pages, so I'm going to be brief. But one point I really want to draw, and I was impressed, was Mark has been a Knight of the French National Order of Merit since 1998 and is quite versatile apart from French in English, Russian, and Polish. Welcome, Mark. Welcome to this dialogue.
Thank you again for the kind invitation.
Finally, we have with us our very own and knowledgeable Honorable Dr. Joe Thomas. He's Associate Dean of Faculty of Sustainability Studies at Dr. Vishwanath Karad, MIT World Peace University. Before this, he was the Executive Director of Partners in Population for Development, an international intergovernmental organization of 26 developing countries promoting South-South cooperation. He has extensive experience in international diplomacy, development cooperation, and humanitarian assistance. At our university, Dr. Thomas provides leadership for our sustainability programs and has been working very closely on our peace initiatives. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. As we embark on this panel,
Thank you, Darshan.
you're welcome. As we embark on this panel, I would quickly like to spend a couple of minutes going to a short video that was prepared as opening remarks for the June conference. That is where Dr. Karad gave the description for the cause and why we should pick up this as a cause. Tech team, can you relay that video?
My learned friends, almost for the 2 months, not only India, but the entire world is facing a very horrifying situation of the lockdown period and also the horrifying silence because of the coronavirus, the COVID-19. The fear is so horrifying that the fear of death by the coronavirus is hovering around all the world, and you are fully aware that the nations like America, China, Russia, Britain, France, the most powerful nations of the whole world, including the other 160 nations, they are completely closed. You can see a very typical fearful silence on all the roads, the shops, the universities, colleges, malls, everything is closed. And the people have been locked down in their own houses for their own safety. It is but natural, but remember, friends, that this has been caused at the command of what is called as a coronavirus. I do not know and understand that this coronavirus, when it gave a command, for the first time in the human history, all the churches, the temples, the mosques and the masjids like Makkah, Medina too, the gurudwaras, and all other prayer halls and everything is completely closed. It has never happened before in the history, and normally, friends, remember, We have never been expecting that such an experience will be given to us in our lifetime. I know that the great people, the Security Council members and the WHO people, they have been trying their level best to control this whole process, but we sincerely feel that on the background of the horrifying hydrogen bomb which was dropped on Hiroshima, which has caused the death of lakhs of people, maybe the crores of people were affected. And that bell of Hiroshima has started ringing once again. And this bell of Hiroshima is ringing once again to give the message of world peace and trying to give a warning, giving a clarion call to the entire world to think and understand the horrifying effects of what you are trying to produce.
Thank you, sir. So this were the remarks just 2 months in lockdown. India went into lockdown on March 21, and this conference was hosted in June. Today, we are almost in October, and the situation has pretty much with coronavirus remained same, though the lockdowns have changed. But we are in the same ship globally. And with this background, I invite Mark to share his opening remarks on this subject.
Thank you so much, Darshan. If I may, I have a short PowerPoint presentation just to identify some key points, some of which
are... Can we give him screen sharing rights, please?
Yes. Can you?
Yes, you can share now.
Yes. Okay. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
All right. Just a few definitions, some of which have already been mentioned. Biological weapons first. I know there are some scientific discussions about whether this includes only living organisms. And the question actually is asked about viruses, which are not, strictly speaking, living organisms, but actually need living cells to replicate. And chemical weapons, I would say it's an easier definition. Toxic chemicals and delivery means. Now, it's of course, it's an old weapon. These are both old weapons that were used in ancient times, but it started to be regulated in the 19th century with the Brussels Declaration, then the Hague Conventions, and as your colleague said, the Geneva Protocol, which banned the use in war of bacteriological methods of warfare. At that time, of course, only bacteria were known as biological agents, but as we know now, there are more. What's interesting is that in the Nuremberg trials, the Hague Convention was declared universally applicable, even if states hadn't signed or ratified this convention. It was considered universally applicable. And of course, then the Geneva Convention superseded that Hague Convention and applied the same norm of universally prohibited biological weapons. Chemical weapons, very similar. Also the Brussels Declaration, the Hague Convention, included in the Hague regulations, and also it finds its way in the Geneva Protocol. Now, Geneva Protocol, of course, was initiated after the end of the First World War, during which chemical weapons were used on a large scale. Now, more recent uses of biological weapons in the 18th century, in Second World War by Japan against China. In the 20th and 21st century, some terrorist attacks, more or less successful. Chemical weapons were used, as I said, on large scale in the First World War. Less in the Second World War, but still by Japan against China, and of course by Germany in the death camps. Now, the United States also used a chemical defoliant in the Vietnam War that still has consequences today, many years later. And of course, during the war between Iran and Iraq, and Iran used also chemical weapons, not only against its enemy, Iraq, but also against its own Kurdish population. The more recent uses, of course, we know have taken place in Syria, in the Syrian civil war, both by the Syrian regular forces and by the Islamic State. Now, the modern prohibition of biological weapons goes back to 1972 with the Biological and Toxic Weapon Convention, which banned not only the use that was already banned by the Geneva Protocol, but development, production, stockpile of these weapons, and provides for their destruction, their full elimination. But because of this absence of mention of use, it was thought necessary to clarify that use also is banned, and this was done in 1996. The problem with this convention, as we know, is that it doesn't have any verification provisions. It's based on good faith. There was an attempt to negotiate a verification protocol, but it was rejected by the United States in 2001. The only leftover, I would say, from these efforts are regular meetings of states parties and experts taking place in Geneva, as well as a series of voluntary confidence building measures. It's a very quasi-universal treaty with only 10 states which haven't signed or ratified. And the Chemical Weapons Convention, adopted in 1993, also bans production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons and provides for the destruction. And contrary to the Biological Weapons Convention, it has verification, very stringent verification provisions, and an organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, based in The Hague, that conducts inspections on site with the states that have declared chemical weapons for their destruction, and states that haven't declared them, but have chemical industry that also needs to be inspected. This is even more universal than the Biological Weapons Convention, because only 4 states are not party to this convention. As you may know, of course, in both conventions, there are a number of states in the Middle East which have remained outside, not necessarily because they have these weapons, but because there is this linkage with Israel not being party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, why were these weapons restricted and prohibited? If you go back to the Geneva Protocol.
Mark, may I interfere here for a moment?
Yes, I will. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I was just going to interfere for a moment and request you to pause, because I just wanted to draw in Andrew into this conversation before we would continue with the background of these restrictions. Or would you like to complete this before I draw Andrew in?
I just have a couple slides left, so let me finish.
Fair enough.
Because my main point is this one: why we restricted and prohibited these weapons.
Fair enough.
In the Geneva Protocol, this was because their prohibition should bind alike the conscience and practice of nations. And in the Biological Conventions, Biological Weapons Convention, because their use would be repugnant to the conscience of mankind. And it's very similar provision also in the preamble of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So these humanitarian considerations are absolutely justified, first because there are no military uses of these weapons. There are no military utility, as this was proven in both world wars. And today, main victims in conflicts are civilians, and therefore they would be the main victims of these weapons. The problem is that now pathogens and toxic chemicals are easily accessible, available. So therefore, this increases the risk of use in civil war or by terrorists, by non-state actors. So basically, the main paradigm, which is called humanitarian disarmament, is based on this phrase: when you cannot regulate, which is the case for these weapons, you eliminate them because of their unacceptable impact on civilians. This was the same paradigm was applied to some conventional weapons, anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, so-called inhumane weapons. And to conclude, maybe this is a controversial conclusion, it also should be applied to nuclear weapons, because any use of these weapons would cause the most devastating humanitarian consequences, in particular among civilians. This would be maybe food for thought for further discussion or another seminar, but let me conclude on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. At this stage, I would actually like to join Andrew. Andrew, I remember way back back in June, you had touched upon this topic of disarmament. You'd also touched upon the facts that Mark brought out. Where is the gap now? I see that there are these laws. This is what Mark has said. It's made on the humanitarian grounds. If you cannot prevent, stop the proliferation. Why isn't it happening? Where is the gap that you see from your work perspective as to why this is not actually transpiring into the disarmament that we wish to see?
Well, unfortunately, we've made so much progress, but now it seems to be the world is backsliding. So the gap is, first, those countries that haven't yet joined the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. I think we need to redouble our efforts to pressure those countries to make these conventions universal. And then most disturbing to me, having dedicated my entire career to eradication of these horrific weapons and continuing outside of government now on this issue, is the use of chemical weapons by the Russian Federation in Salisbury, and very recently in Omsk, Russia, against the opposition figure Navalny, where they used the Novichok chemical weapons in flagrant violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Also, North Korea used a third generation chemical weapon, VX, in an attack at the airport in Kuala Lumpur several years ago. And of course, Syria launched a massive attack in August of 2013 using sarin chemical weapons, killing about 1,400 innocent men, women, and children. So these uses of chemical weapons underscore the need for the world to come together to hold these governments, these perpetrators of crimes against humanity, accountable. They cannot get away with this with impunity, because then the message will be that, well, it's okay. So the norms are breaking down, and that's the biggest gap right now. And it's further aggravated by the democratization of technology. So especially the ability to develop biological weapons is becoming very, very widespread and accessible not just to states like North Korea that have an advanced biological weapons program, but even to small terrorist groups like ISIS, formerly Al-Qaeda had a biological weapons program at Tarnak Farms in Afghanistan that we were able to stop in the fall of 2001. And other groups even in the South Asian region are pursuing these weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you, Andrew. Actually, you raised two interesting questions, and one of them gets back to Mark. Andrew, in your talk, you say that we should get remaining countries to join both the conventions, the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Mark, the question is it helpful if we get all the countries to join these conventions? How helpful would that be, considering the limitations of those conventions in itself? Could you just help us understand the limitations of those conventions and really the help of having those countries join this convention? Where does that work? And the second part of that question is, by a country joining, great, a country might be a part of it. What about those small groups who are developing these weapons on their own? And how do we really bring control on them? Because Andrew did touch upon some of those fringe elements in his speech. So I think this is a question to both of you, but we'll kind of have a perspective from Mark and then move back to Andrew. Mark, over to you, please.
Yes, to summarize, I would say this is necessary but not sufficient. Obviously, we need universal conventions, as universal as possible. I would say maybe among those states absent from, especially the Biological Weapons Convention, there are a number of micro-states which may not cause a great deal of threat or risk. It's just maybe for lack of resources, lack of interest, but it's so that should be part of the work of the other states parties to explain to them, to promote universality of the treaty. As I said, for a number of states, there is a specific regional problem in the Middle East between Israel, Egypt, Syria, which are absent to variable degrees from either or both conventions. And this is why, and this is because, as I said, there is this problem of Israeli nuclear armament, and the other Arab countries, that some of them at least have tried to use this as a form of pressure or leverage to push Israel to give up its nuclear capabilities. As we have seen, this has been completely ineffective. So that's why there's been these very long discussions of a potential zone free of all weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear, chemical, and biological, in the Middle East. And as we know, this has been opposed several times by Israel, not necessarily in the long run, but at least in the short term. They're not ready to even start discussing their nuclear capabilities. So that's why it's stuck. But to answer the other part of your question, obviously this universality would be a major factor, but this is not enough. That's why we have other instruments or other obligations. The first, for the treaty parties, there is an obligation to legislate domestically, to adopt prohibitions, criminalization, to prevent anyone within their jurisdiction to use or to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. There is even a legal obligation on all states member of the United Nations from Resolution 1540 of the UN Security Council, adopted in 2004, which, within Chapter 7, that means it's really legally binding, including on the states which are not party to these conventions. That means they have to take part in this global effort to prevent the spread and use of weapons of mass destruction. One of the obligations is to report on measures taken. And as we know, as is clear, there are a number of states which are more transparent than others. And that's another area where some improvement could be made, especially under the oversight or the pressure of parliaments or civil society organizations. And the final remark is precisely that governments alone cannot do everything. This was already accepted in the framework of the Biological Weapons Convention, because as I said, there was no agreement on verification measures. There was a sort of common denominator to continue assessing the risk, discussing what can be done in terms of getting on board the scientific community, the industry, academia, researchers, etc., so that, again, this would be done within a so-called multi-stakeholder approach. And this has been, I would say, fairly successful. Again, it can be improved, it can be expanded, but we have now, I would say, growing awareness, and even more so now after the pandemic, of this potential global risk of pandemic, and therefore understanding, awareness that something must be done to prevent any deliberate, intentional use of pathogens, whether it's for terrorist purposes or criminal purposes, or just out of accident, like lack of biosafety measures, lack of resources. So that's why, again, as we can see, we can only fight against such a disease because it's transnational, using international cooperation, international organizations, sharing information, sharing good practices, research in vaccinations, etc. But this can also be applied to any prevention of intentional use of these horrendous weapons.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that. Though my question still pertains that what you've spoken are all legal frameworks. And we've known how the loopholes work in this legal framework. And the larger question, which Andrew, you had mentioned last time, was that when UN could intervene, UN hasn't intervened. When countries could control, they haven't controlled. So the gap between policy, legislation, and actual action on the ground still remains. Especially from your experience, Andrew, and you showed us that small vial of chemicals that you showed us and said this could actually be disastrous enough for everyone. How do you answer this question? How do we bridge this gap between the theory of the legislation and the practice on the ground, and identification of those fringe elements and controlling those, while we really look at nation states as well?
Yeah, it's very difficult because essentially countries need to understand, and UN Security Council Resolution 1540 helps in this regard, but they need to understand that within the borders of probably every country in the world, there are capabilities that could be misused to develop biological or chemical weapons. So they need to think in those terms and take actions on the ground to prevent access, to consolidate into fewer facilities, safer laboratories with security, veterinary facilities that have Bacillus anthracis that causes anthrax. We need to move away from culturing bacteria and virus and use modern molecular diagnostics, which are faster and cheaper and now more reliable than the old-fashioned methods. So that is what I call the supply side for weapons of mass destruction, and we need to take more action to secure, to lock down, to prevent bad actors from gaining access to these materials. Because in my 20 years of observing efforts by terrorist groups starting with Aum Shinrikyo in 1995 and their biological weapons program, which is lesser known than their sarin chemical weapons program. All the way to the present time, what we've seen is that terrorist groups have not been able to obtain the starter cultures to make biological weapons. And so we need to redouble our efforts. And I agree with Mark entirely that universality in the conventions, the two conventions, is necessary but not sufficient. Especially the BWC, but there are ways we can strengthen both of these conventions. President of Kazakhstan, President Tokayev in New York at the UN General Assembly earlier this week in his speech suggested creation of an international agency for biological security, analogous to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that could help implement the Biological Weapons Convention and prevent accidents, but also misuse, deliberate use, development of biological weapons. So there's a lot more we can do. And then I'll say something with biological weapons. One of the good things is that science, technology, medicine, I mean, after all, these are just infectious diseases. So we at the Council on Strategic Risks launched over a year ago a new program that we call Making Biological Weapons Obsolete. And we think that we can do this. We can both deter countries from developing biological weapons by having better preparedness and making them realize that their weapons will not be effective. But if we have a global early warning system for infectious disease to monitor viruses and bacteria, to sequence them, identify them early, we can prevent epidemics from starting and certainly from becoming pandemics. And then there has been a rapid acceleration during the wartime situation that we're undergoing today against COVID-19. And you know, my heart breaks that India just surpassed 100,000 deaths. The United States is now over 210,000 deaths. The terrible costs of this shows that we need to invest in countermeasures. But this fight against the coronavirus has accelerated the medical science, and we now have both therapeutics and vaccines that were created extremely rapidly from the day that China posted the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2. Within weeks, we had prototype vaccines based on the genetic sequence. And so improving on those capabilities to respond rapidly, I think, is part of this system of early warning and rapid response that can, along with these other international measures and